Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story. It is March the 18th, and we're glad to be able to join with you today. It's day 77 of our reading. We're in Deuteronomy chapter 21, and we're going to look at 6 verses, I guess, 15 to 21, and I think I'll just read the whole passage. It says, Suppose a man has two wives. Suppose a man has 2 wives, but he loves one and not the other, and both have given him sons. And suppose the firstborn son is of the wife he does not love. When the man divides his inheritance, he may not give the larger inheritance to his younger son, the son of the wife he loves, as if he were the firstborn son. He must recognize the rights of his oldest son, the son of the wife he does not love, by giving him a double portion. He is the first son of his father's virility, and the rights of the firstborn belong to him. Suppose a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father and mother, even though they discipline him. In such case, the father and mother must take the son to the elders as they hold court at the town gate. The parents must say to the elders, The son of ours is stubborn and rebellious and refuses to obey. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of this town must stone him to death. In this way you will purge this evil from among you, and all Israel will hear about it and be afraid. Two complicated situations.
Interesting.
So it starts out by saying, suppose a man has 2 wives.
First problem. Just saying.
Yeah. So what is, whether it's 2 wives or 2 husbands, or 3, that's for the most part outside of our realm of understanding. Other than divorce and remarriage, we know what it is to have 2 or 3, but one at the time. Mm-hmm. But for the most part here in our culture, we don't see 2 wives or 3 wives at the same time. What are some of the tensions of 2 spouses?
I'm glad to say I don't know. Well, there's some obvious ones to come into play, and we see some of this in these texts here, that there's always going to be competition. There's always going to be attention. There's always going to be competing for, whether it's affection, time, resources, and the list goes on. And I don't see how it can turn out well long term.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a big part of marriage is that you are becoming one flesh. You're living. It's like you're sacrificing a lot of your time and your life for this other person, and I feel like the more people you marry, the more of yourself you have to give away, and I mean it just seems really difficult. I could never imagine being married to multiple people at the same time, because marriage is exhausting sometimes. And that's not a diss on Jess. I'm just saying. I think everyone agrees that.
5 minutes and 12 seconds.
And this is to the guy who's been married how long?
3.5 years ago now. So yeah,
and it's exhausting.
Yeah, but
I want to come back to that. So don't let me forget you used the word exhausting, because I do want to come back to it.
Okay.
But I want to talk. I want to finish the conversation about multiple spouses. Mm-hmm. I think there are obvious challenges with it. I heard a pastor say, he said the only thing worse than not having a piano player was having 2 piano players. He said when you didn't have a piano player, there's no choice to make. You just ain't got one. He said when you got 2 and they both want to play,
creates problems.
Then you got a problem. Mm-hmm. And the devotion that's required is even in divorce and remarriage, there's still certain tensions that are present, particularly if there are children involved, that make it difficult to do the right thing, be fair, not be harsh, not harm, and without a doubt, you're probably going to have an affinity for one and not the other. Maybe not all of the time, but at least some of the time. So we've already had this story between Rachel, Leah, and Jacob. And he loved Rachel. Mm-hmm. He didn't love Leah so much. He got snookered into marrying her. That's kind of how it looks. And there's a tension between the wives. he gets put in the middle, and I think that sometimes in the church, even though we're not talking about polygamy, we don't deal with that. We do deal with divorce and remarriage frequently. I would guess at least 30% of our people are in that category, maybe more, but if I had to guess, they're at least affected by it. They're the children of, that they have been. And if that's the case, we have to have some understanding of the challenges that they face. And also when we're talking to young married couples, you for example, to tell them, picking somebody else isn't going to be easier. You may love them more, but there's going to be a tension present, for inheritances, favor, all of those things.
Yeah, it gets complicated. Just more and more complicated as you compound or multiply the numbers of relationships.
Right. And, the other thing I was going to ask, so God is trying to tell them to take the emotions out of their judgment.
Yeah.
He says, you may love this one and not this one, but the right thing to do is still the right thing to do. How do emotions cloud our judgment? That's kind of where I'd like to spend a couple minutes. How do they cloud our judgment?
Happens all the time. In our intimate relationships, it happens. Our peripheral relationships, it happens. It's easy for me to have a thought process in this moment if this relationship is going good, and I'm tracking this direction. But something can happen in a moment's time. My emotions change, and if I'm not careful or intentional, I will often make different decisions based on the emotions. And the problem with emotions is they ebb and flow. They come and go. And here he was saying this is something that's been established for a long time. There's a reason, a purpose for it. And to make those decisions and important decisions based on emotions and feelings is a dangerous thing.
Yeah, recently we were just talking about driving under the influence and driving, and even with this, even when you're angry or upset or you're crying, you don't want to drive, because it can impact your discernment, it can impact your decision making, and with any decision that you're making, if you're making it in a state of heightened emotion, it could go any way, it could be very dangerous. And so it's good to look back, like you were saying, to look at something that is concrete, that stays the same, like looking at God's word that stays the same, and looking to that for wisdom and guidance even when we're in an emotional state, so that we can, instead of just making it on the fly. Because I think I've made the worst decisions I've made in my life have usually been made in a place where I was not myself, not in when I was either very angry, or I was upset, or I was really sad by something that happened. And so it's really important that we do look back at something that is concrete, like here, the way he's giving them the law here. Even though it seems like a very dramatic example that may not apply to everybody, it's important to look back, because when you're in that heightened state of being upset, it can really impact things.
We should never make decisions, the truth of the matter, we should never make decisions, big decisions, important decisions, when we are in the midst of chaos, turmoil, our emotions, just being extremely exhausted or tired. You can make a decision in that moment that you otherwise would not have made that doesn't turn out so well.
I was just talking with the students about this recently, because we were talking about, we have a few people who have died recently in the church, and even family of some of our students, and the decisions that have to be made once someone dies, with funeral preparations and getting the casket and all these things. Those are some of the most difficult and expensive decisions you could make, and you have to make them right after the loss of a loved one.
Unless you've removed that element and done it, but
ahead of time.
Yeah, ahead of time, so that you are calm, rational, and you can think through that process and make some decisions. But it's a practical example that's all around us.
Yeah, we usually think of our emotions related to our heart. This is how we feel, And the Bible tells us that our heart's one of the biggest liars on the planet. It deceives us. Your anger can deceive you. I fell in love can deceive you. Your trust can deceive you. All of those things can throw you out of balance. If you're not prepared. And I think it's important for us to understand. That's one of the things. I remember hearing at a group of teenagers. It was a big youth conference, and the guy speaking said, you need to make some decisions ahead of time so that when you find yourself in that situation, your emotions don't override you. You know, so he's talking about often what happens in the backseat of a car between two teenagers was their emotions got the best of them. But had they made a decision long before that I'm not going there, then it's easier, you know, to control the emotions in those moments.
Yeah.
So, Zach, you said marriage is exhausting. That's the word you use.
Not all the time. Okay, it's just sometimes.
But you have a 2-year-old, right? Olive's 2, right?
Yeah.
And you have another one on the way. Is it marriage that's exhausting, or is it the concept of family, the work that family requires?
Definitely marriage.
Okay.
Okay. He gave you an out.
I was trying.
He tried to help
you. Okay. Only it's deeper.
I think, well, it's, you know, just living with somebody, living with a different person, we have very different, you know, it's like there are so many things we have in common, and I think it's important in marriage, and like the things that are most important to us, God, then our family, you know, like in that order, you know, like we both agree on that, and we're both clear on that. But even still, there are little things, and it's not like we argue all the time or something like that. But there's still tensions that happen. Emotions, exactly. Emotions and tensions that just happen. I mean, in any relationship, but it's heightened when you're always.
So okay, I think it's fair to talk to address this. So, in our house, there are a couple of things that are off limits. All right, we don't talk about divorce. We don't talk about separation. Those things are predetermined. So when emotions get in the way, those things don't get brought up.
It's not an issue,
right? Because we've set some rules, some boundaries, some groundwork. Much like he's saying here, if your emotions get out of whack sometimes, you know, I'm sick of you, you know, whatever, you know, but there has to be some ground rules that you say, okay, I'm not going here, no matter how mad I am, no matter how frustrated I am, no matter how hurt I am. These are the rules, you know, and I think that's important because you're not alone, by the way. You know, I'm throwing you to the wolves, but you're not by yourself.
You know, I think every relationship mirrors that to some degree, but you know, marriage in particular, that's the easy example. But you've got two different people. You talked about you throw children into that mix. You throw careers and financial stressors in that. You throw health issues into that. Just the busyness of life, and all those things can create emotions and feelings. That can lead us down a wrong path or cause us to make bad choices and decisions in the moment if we don't have clearly predefined boundaries and safe limits in place.
Yeah, I feel like too, just being, like I was saying before, living with somebody changes things. I mean, when you have one wife in the picture and you're living together, I mean, I'll say this, I had more arguments, I think, with my roommate in college, living with him, than I do with my wife now, even though I love him. And, you know, I think being separated from him has helped
He's got separation anxiety.
I think has helped our relationship. But I hope he doesn't listen to this podcast. Oh, gosh.
I'm loving this podcast.
Oh gosh, we should delete this one. But you know, but the more people you add, and especially with that, being close quarters with them, like even with family, the more family members you have, I think too, there's a beauty in that, having family around all the time. But there's also, you know how to get on each other's nerves, you know how to bother each other, and especially with having, I mean, imagine having 2 wives. I mean, that would be so. I can't imagine the amount of tension that would be in that situation, living with those 2 people.
It wouldn't just add issues, it would multiply them.
Yeah, well, I would think 2 would be worse than 12.
2 wives would be worse than 12 wives?
Yeah, of 2 spouses. I mean,
about
you look at
900? Like,
I mean, because
yeah.
You know, at some point, the numbers, you go, yeah, whatever. I'm really a single person that's attached to this person. But 2 is, I think that's a tough number. Yeah. So let's talk about the rebellious child
before we get in trouble.
Worse. Trouble. So it says this child is, suppose they have a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father and mother even though they discipline him. But stubborn and rebellious, when I first read that, I think slightly different than their description of it. So the two things that they consider to be stubborn and rebellious are gluttony and drunkenness. Okay, so the thing that either surprised me is either that I have to process that's not for our culture. Because they often for generations lived in the same house, the same compound. You know, there was a person, a patriarch that took the lead for the whole family, you know, if you will. Either the young kids were drinking way earlier than what I'm used to, or the older adults still had some rules to live by. Either way, I would take it that it's probably older adults that just aren't, haven't grown up yet. That's probably how I would describe it. But what are some other ways that people can be rebellious other than drunkenness and gluttony? What are some other challenges to being a parent?
I think if they're lying constantly, I think that can be rebellious, and they're doing things behind your back that they're not supposed to do. Trying to think of some other ones, but pretty much any sin could be seen as rebellion against God, but also your parents if it's against their will and what they want for you.
You know, and kind of to tie in with this, I picture this son. We don't know how old, but I think he's older. He appears, because he's described as a glutton and a drunkard, he appears to be lazy. He won't work. He doesn't contribute to the household. Won't take responsibility. He doesn't want to do anything productive. And I think those all can be forms of rebellion to various degrees, depending on how long it has lasted, depending on how much opportunity they've had, depending on how much you have worked with them, and the list goes on. So yeah, it can cover a wide range of aspects.
Yeah, Jay and I both have adult kids. They don't live at home. You know, they have, as my kids have been at home as adults for periods of time. You have a small kid. She is dependent on you. The older you get, the less dependent they are. And then the influence becomes important, not the demands. You know, that becomes a challenge. And there's a real tension there that's present, trying to guide, direct, you know, and rebelliousness creates confrontation.
Sure.
And sometimes as a parent, you don't handle that correctly. Sometimes as a child, you don't handle that correctly. And managing that is, I think, extremely important.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for parents of older children / young adults is to distinguish between what actually is, quote, rebellion or stubbornness, and what is actually their independence and growth, and the adjustments that we have to make to recognize that and to give them some boundaries and some extra space, as it were, to grow and develop. And that can be a challenge, particularly if they're still at home, I think, more than if they've already moved out.
Yeah. Well, good. I know I don't want to continue this. I think there's a lot we could talk about here in both of these things, but we need to wind it down. So, any last thoughts?
Well, I was gonna say, if your child is being stubborn or gluttonous, like my siblings stealing the on Sunday mornings and Saturday mornings we're allowed to have sugary cereal. They'd always steal all the sugary cereal before I could wake up. I wish I knew this passage before, so I could have referenced this when I was a kid.
So you could have stoned them.
So I could have stoned them. I'm gonna say that's my only recommendation: is don't stone your children. And I think that's probably a good way to end it.
That is wise advice.
Although my wife may stone me after this, we'll see.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the reminder today in your word that there are challenges in all relationships, whether it's husbands and wives or parents and children. And there are ground rules that are beneficial for us to set so that when our emotions are challenged and things do get out of whack, we are able to know that there is a baseline, some things that we can always depend on. Grant us grace as parents, grant us grace as spouses, and help us to be what you desire us to be. In Jesus' name.